We are done with the cranial nerves. Now the peripheral nervous system consists of cranial nerves and spinal nerves, so the rest of this chapter has to do with spinal nerves. There is 12 pairs of cranial nerves that we went through. Some are motor, some are sensory, some are mixed. There's 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So now you're thinking, oh wow, I have to learn all 31 spinal nerves, but quite a bit easier here because all 31 pairs of spinal nerves that we can see one of the pairs on the left side of the body, right? We got 31 spinal nerves here. They are all mixed. So they're all motor, they're all sensory, right? For sensation throughout the body, for motor throughout the body, as well to your muscles. And well, what about naming all 31 pairs? Well, look at their names. That should look very familiar when we went through the vertebra, right? So we have 8 cervical cranial nerves, C1 through C8. There's 12 thoracic spinal nerves, so they're just named according to the vertebrae which they exit from. The only thing that's a little bit different is that there's 8 cervical spinal nerves, but only 7 cervical vertebrae. You don't see the vertebrae here. So you have 1 extra cervical spinal nerve than you do vertebrae. But with thoracics, there's still 12. Lumbars, there's 5, just like the bones. Sacrum, there's 5 segments, and there's just 1 coccyx spinal nerve. This slide explains what I mentioned on the previous slide. There's 7 cervical vertebrae, but there's 8 spinal nerves. And this is just talking about where they exit, which is not that important, but just kind of bear that in mind. That's a key fact there, right? That there's only 7 cervical bones, but 8 cervical spinal nerves. I'm going to show you this on a picture, which is on the next slide, but let me just kind of go through this first. A spinal nerve is going to branch into, or is going to, stem from roots. So how does the spinal cord connect to the spinal nerve? Well, we've seen these on the previous PowerPoint. There's a ventral root and a dorsal root. So you can read through this on how ventral's motor, dorsal sensory. We went through that last PowerPoint. I'm going to just quickly go through this again on the picture on the next slide, and the roots come together to form the spinal nerve. Let's look at the picture so this makes a little more sense. You should remember your gray horns in the spinal cord, but that's in the central nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, there's 2 roots. Here's the dorsal root is sensory, so that's information going into the central nervous system. Your ventral root is motor, so that's information or impulses moving out of the central nervous system. So where they connect right here, that's your spinal nerve. Spinal nerve is really short, actually, because it's going to branch almost immediately into different subsections, which we're going to go through next. And don't forget where our cell bodies are located here of these sensory neurons. It's called the dorsal root ganglion. There's no ganglion in the ventral root because the cell bodies are actually inside the spinal cord in the ventral horn. We said the spinal nerves are pretty short because they're going to branch off into subsections. Well, their sections that they branch off into are called rami. There's a dorsal ramus, a ventral ramus, and there's a white and gray ramus, which we call rami communicantes. That's fine. So let's look at the next 2 slides have pictures, so I'll explain these on the next couple of slides. So let's get your bearings here because it's a little busy. Here's your dorsal root with the dorsal root ganglion, which is sensory. And here's your ventral root, which is purely motor. Where the 2 roots come together right here is the spinal nerve. Like we said, the spinal nerve is really short because it's going to branch into really 3 sections. Most of your body is in front of the spine and the spinal cord. So the ventral root is going to be the largest, even though they look all the same size. This is actually your biggest root because now that we become the spinal nerve, it's a mixed nerve because it contains both sensory and motor. When they come together, it's mixed, so all their branches are mixed too. So you have a ventral ramus, goes to the front of the body, dorsal ramus, which is going to be a lot smaller because there's not much behind here. There's just muscle and skin right behind the spine. Dorsal ramus goes to the posterior side of the body, and then we have this rami communicantes right here, which is made up of a gray and white ramus. That's a way in and a way off of it. This is your sympathetic nervous system, so we're not going to really deal with this now. Your last chapter, number 15, is the autonomic nervous system, which is sympathetic is part of. We'll deal with that then. So the main thing to know here is the two roots are divided into sensory dorsal and motor ventral. They come together to form the mixed spinal nerve, and the spinal nerve is going to break up into rami, a dorsal ramus and a much bigger ventral ramus, because there's a lot of tissue and organs right in front of the body. Next picture is not as busy, so I'm going to kind of explain this one more time on a more simplified picture. Here's your ventral root, motor. There's your dorsal root, sensory. There's the dorsal root ganglion, where the two roots come together. This is your spinal nerve, although it's not labeled. Spinal nerve will break up into rami, a posterior or dorsal ramus that says posterior, but we can call it dorsal ramus for behind the body, and then your much larger ventral ramus, also called anterior ramus. Remember, ventral and anterior mean the same thing. That's mixed going to the front of the body. And of course, we have the white and gray ramus, which go to the sympathetic nervous system. We'll deal with that in chapter 15. But right now, we're going to kind of keep going. We're going to keep moving from the largest arm, the largest ramus, which is the ventral ramus or anterior ramus. And those rami that we looked at in the previous two slides, those pictures, remember that occurs at every level. That happens 31 times because there's 31 pairs of spinal nerves where you have the roots, the spinal nerve and the rami branching off. Well, the ventral rami is where we're going to kind of continue from here because it's the largest of the rami, are going to form plexuses, nerve plexuses. Because if we look at it, well, when we're in the thoracics, all these kind of ventral rami are parallel to each other. They don't intertwine. But if we look up in the cervical area, kind of at the base of the neck, even in the lumbars and sacrum, all of these spinal nerves that become ventral rami, they all start to kind of mix up together, and it looks like they're all tangled together in the lumbars here and the sacrum too. So that's what a plexus is. A nerve plexus is an area where these ventral rami of spinal nerves intertwine. That happens in the cervical area, right here, which we call the brachial area. So there's a cervical plexus, a brachial plexus. Brachial means arm, and these nerves are going to end up heading down the arm. You have a lumbar plexus, intertwining of neurons, and then you have a sacral plexus. What's important here there is to know there's no thoracic plexus because there's no intertwining. These just become intercostal nerves. They just run in between your ribs parallel to each other. But we need to go through the four major plexuses, cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacrum, and figure out, well, what nerves arise from each of these four plexuses. And this is just saying your thoracic, not T1, but most of your thoracics, T2 to T12, become intercostal nerves. There's no plexus there. The back of your body is supplied by the dorsal rami, so I already mentioned that. This is point 2 and 3.1 is we're going to go through the plexuses, which you don't see in this picture. Yeah, this is just also mentioning that, yeah, that gray and white rami communicantes go to the sympathetic nervous system. That's number 4. Again, that's chapter 15. Let's go to the 4 plexuses now.